Today I want to go back to a very different Australia. This is Australia directly after the Second World War. We're talking late 40s through to the 1950s. The world had just entered the Cold War, the long standoff between the United States and its allies against the Soviet Union, which was then still ruled by Joseph Stalin. After World War II, it was revealed that the Soviet Union was running espionage networks all over the world. And so Australia responded by establishing ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, to hunt Soviet spies and to monitor subversive organisations that were acting on Moscow's behalf. And it did this by sending in agents to infiltrate dissident organisations. But these agents, these sparrows, as ASIO called them, were not highly trained professional spies. They were housewives and migrants and union officials who lived a double life for years at a time. Phillip Deery is Emeritus Professor of History at Victoria University, and he's been looking at ASIO's case files from the post-war era to bring together the stories of individuals in Australia that ASIO considered a security risk or a potential enemy agent, and also at some of those ordinary people selected by ASIO to infiltrate subversive organisations within Australia. And Phillip's also looked behind the scenes to see the machinations and motivations of the Australian governments of the time. His fascinating book is called Spies and Sparrows, ASIO and the Cold War. Hello, Phillip.
Hello, Richard.
This all starts with something called the Winona Project in the United States. Can you tell me something about this project?
Sure. The Winona Project was a top-secret code-breaking operation. In fact, so top secret that the American president, Harry Truman, wasn't made aware of it. It's a small number of code breakers who gradually unravelled and decrypted the top secret, seemingly unbreakable codes from the Moscow Centre, which is the Centre for Intelligence Operations around the world, to various embassies, particularly the embassy in Washington, in London, but also in Australia. And so there are a number of codes sent from Moscow Centre to the Soviet embassy in Canberra, which were broken. Now, those codes revealed that there was, in fact, Soviet espionage conducted in Australia, and in particular one department, the Department of External Affairs, which was then led by the inimitable Dr. Evatt, Herbert Vere Evatt, who was also Attorney General and Deputy Prime Minister.
Now, who were these people who were working for Moscow in those times, who were embedded in the Department of External Affairs as it was in those days?
They were members of the Communist Party or covert members of the Communist Party. And these people worked in what was called the Post-Hostilities Division of the Department of External Affairs. And they forwarded to a chap called Wally Clayton, and his code name was Clod, K-L-O-D. And he said almost on his deathbed, God, they gave me a crappy name, didn't they? And Clod passed certain documents on to his contact in the Soviet embassy. And one was, for example, they're mainly British documents, Richard. One concerned post-war planning that Britain intended for the region. So they were top secret, highly classified, and potentially posed a threat to, if you like, to Australia's national security.
So how did the United States react when they realised that there was a nest of spies operating high up in the Department of External Affairs in Australia?
With enormous alarm and concern. And one of the responses of the United States was to break off transmission of all classified material to the United Kingdom, because these were British documents which were passed from, if you like, from London to Canberra. And so their abrupt and draconian action sent alarm bells, of course, through Whitehall and Canberra. And both governments, the Attlee Labor government in England and the Chifley Labor government in Australia, scrambled to try and pacify the Americans so that this embargo of classified documents would be lifted.
So this is what got Australia, the Chifley government in Australia, scrambling to set up ASIO.
That's right. Although Chifley and certainly Evatt were sceptical about the formation of a new security service, they were left with no choice. Otherwise, they were going to be completely excluded from, if you like the Five Eyes Agreement, from access to important information. So it was the British government which placed enormous pressure on Chifley and Deadman, the Minister for Defence, to set up a new security organisation, which became ASIO in March 1949.
And what was their remit, Philip? What were their specific tasks that they were entrusted to by the Chifley government at the time?
The specific task wasn't counter-subversion, but counter-espionage. So it was attempting to locate the identities of those who had been identified in the Winona documents. So to try and find out the nature, the extent, and the identification of the Soviet spies, if you like, in Australia. And that was its main function. So it wasn't set up as commonly believed because of the fear of communism internally. It shifted from a counter-espionage to a counter-subversion function, and that underpins many of the stories in the book.
Now, at that time, union membership was way higher than it is now, and there was a war going on in the union movement between factions of the Labor Party and factions of the Communist Party within the union movement of the day. How strong was the Communist Party in Australia's union movement in these immediate post-war years, Philip?
Well, in the immediate post-war years, it was very strong. In fact, the communists nearly captured the ACTU Congress leadership. And it was that fact, or that near fact, that so concerned one B.A. Santa Maria. And he was alarmed, and that underpinned the formation of the Catholic Social Studies movement, known as the Movement. And the movement became the foot soldiers of what were known as the ALP industrial groups. So it became a struggle between the groupers and the comms, and that continued right through into the 1950s. So a lot of that was due to the strength in the post-war period of the Communist Party, and that manifested itself in a series of strikes in the 1940s, which communists either actively participated in, precipitated, or sometimes initiated.
One of the things that happened around about that time in 1948 was the nation of Czechoslovakia was overtaken in a kind of a Communist Party coup d'etat in 1948. And effectively, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was a fifth column. It was acting on orders directly on behalf of the Soviet Union. Their primary loyalty was to Stalin rather than to their own country. Was there a view at the time, and was it true that the Communist Party in the late 1940s in Australia was a creature of Stalin and the Soviet Union?
Yeah, very much so. Now, one has to make a distinction between the top levels leadership within the Communist Party and the rank and file, hard-working unionists, it might have been, and housewives in the new housewives associations and in the burgeoning peace movement and so on, who were committed to social equality, social justice, improving the lot of the workers and so on. But if you stand back from that, it is quite reasonable to say that the Communist Party ultimately owed allegiance to the Soviet Union. They were devotees of Stalin. So it was the model to which the Communist Party looked towards. So when you're referring back to the Czech coup in 1948, that rang further alarm bells, because it seemed that here a liberal democracy, which Czechoslovakia was after World War II, a liberal democracy could be overthrown by a well-organised communist coup engineered from Moscow.
So this goes some way to explaining why Ben Chifley, the Labor Prime Minister of Australia, was absolutely so determined to break the communist-inspired coal strike in Australia of 1949 then.
Well, there are a number of factors. The Communist Party in the coal strike decided it was time to appeal to the allegiance of the working class. It wanted to present itself as the true defender of working class interests. So there's a real contest between the Communist Party leadership and the ALP government for the allegiance of the working classes. And this was to be a test case. And Chifley wasn't one to budge. He made a famous speech in Macquarie in his own home district. He said, "This is going to be boots and all." And he did use boots and all to break the strike, which was seen as a communist conspiracy. I actually think that's overblown to call it a communist conspiracy, because miners, for a whole range of reasons, coal miners, were ready to go on strike, and their conditions hadn't improved in the way that had been promised in the immediate post-war period. But the Communist Party certainly prolonged it, thinking that the longer it went, the more repressive the actions of the Chifley Labor government would be, and the working class would desert the Labor Party and move towards the Communist Party. It was a completely mistaken, overblown view, but nevertheless it was one that the Chifley government was not prepared to abide, and broke it ruthlessly, initially through what was called fund freezing legislation. It froze the funds, the strike funds of all unions which could have been used to assist the strike. It jailed a whole series of union leaders who refused to hand over those funds. And then, horror of horror, against the very foundations of the Labor Party, and the Chifley government used the army. So the army went into the open cut mines to mine coal. And that had a tremendous psychological effect, not on the Communist Party in terms of weakening their resolve, but on the miners themselves.
So the strike was defeated then, but nonetheless Chifley lost office. He lost the 1949 election.
Correct.
To the new Liberal Party of Robert Menzies, and Labor was out of power for the next 23 years. Robert Menzies got elected on a platform of wanting to outlaw the Communist Party in Australia. Why did he think this was a matter of absolute urgency at the time?
Why? Because Menzies firmly believed that a World War III was both imminent and inevitable.
You see, this is a real thing, Philip, because I think when we think of the 1950s in Australia, we think it's all with the benefit of hindsight. You think of long years of peace and prosperity, don't you? But really what was going through the government's head at the time was apocalypse, imminent apocalypse, right now, just around the corner.
Yeah, that's right. And one sort of needs to remember the Soviet Union had exploded its atomic bomb in late 1949. So here we've got a conflict, potentially an apocalyptic conflict, not just between good and evil, but between two technologically equal sides of the Cold War, the East and the West. So this concern about imminent World War III underpinned Menzies' concern. So in the event of such a war, where would the Communist Party fit? It would side with the Soviet Union. So it would, in effect, become a fifth column inside Australia, aiding the Red Army aggression. And at one point, Menzies said that Australia is at peace only in a technical sense. And then, of course, the Korean War breaks out in June 1950. So that's when the Cold War turned. So all of these sort of factors make the Communist Party an enemy within, one that mustn't be treated like a, quote, normal political party, but one which had no life, no role in the Australian political community.
Philip, your book is full of stories of individuals, Australian individuals or people living in Australia. And your first example is a brilliant Australian scientist who was called Tom Kaiser. Tell me a bit about Tom Kaiser and the work he'd been doing in Australia.
Yeah, sure. No, Tom was a working class boy from Waterdale Road, Ivanhoe. He got he was also a scholarship boy to the University of Melbourne, where he excelled and came out the top of the class in the area of physics. Then he went to Sydney and he specialised in radio physics. Now, radio physics has a close connection with or was to have a very close connection with guided missiles. So he worked with the CSIRO, and he performed so well that he was able to get a PhD scholarship in Oxford. And his accolades and the referees' reports and so on were so great that he was able to secure the services of Lord Cherwell, who was Churchill's chief scientific advisor during World War II. He was able to get Cherwell as his PhD supervisor. So Tom was a left-leaning chap. So when he was in Australia, he did address meetings under the umbrella of the Australian Association of Scientific Workers. It was an organisation very concerned about the development of atomic warfare, given Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so they were very much concerned with issues of peace. So Tom spoke under their umbrella against the Woomera rocket range, for example, which had just started being developed in 1946, 1947. So when he went to England, the immigration department said, no, he's a person of interest. We're not going to give him a visa. But unbeknown to Tom about all of the monitoring and the surveillance that was happening to him in Australia, as a young bloke, before he did his PhD, he sailed off merrily to London and then got the train to Oxford to do his PhD, which was in that area of radio physics, which he dabbled in at the university and then the CSIR.
So let's just try and pin down his politics a bit here. He's addressing these meetings of these organisations that are alarmed by the potential of nuclear warfare and of nuclear weapons research and the like.
Yeah.
Was he was left-leaning, was he a communist? Was he a member of the Communist Party of Australia as it was in those days?
There is no definite evidence that he was. He was certainly, to use the Cold War parlance, a fellow traveller. So he was close to the Communist Party. He knew people in the Communist Party. When he went to Great Britain, he did join the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain, until 56, when he left after Stalin's crimes were revealed by Khrushchev in February 1956. But ASIO was trying to find evidence to pin down the fact that he was a member of the Communist Party. And the files that I've looked at don't confirm one way or another. But in a sense, anyone who was even close to communism was regarded in this period, and this goes into the 1950s, as actually or potentially subversive.
So on the one hand, his career is directing him higher and higher up and towards the areas of Allied missile research, but on the other hand, his politics are directing him towards closer and closer towards Communist parties. So this is obviously going to identify him. When did it all sort of blow up in his face?
Oh, he was waiting for the outcome of his doctoral thesis, which he did in only 2 years. It's a stellar career he thinks about to await him. And he gets a letter from 2 Australian friends to say, Tom, will you come down to London and participate in a protest demonstration against the Chifley government's actions during the coal strike. So this is July 1949, so it's summer in London. So Tom travels down to London and engages in a very small, very ineffectual protest. I think there are only about 6 of them, the 6 Australians, outside Australia House in the Strand. There was no violence, no arrests, handed out leaflets, and then they all went home. The trouble was that a young woman whom he befriended on the boat coming out to Australia worked for Australia House, recognised him and told the authorities. And then very soon after, he's interviewed by Scotland Yard, and then everything hits the fan. And we have articles in like the tabloid newspapers in London, red atom bomb scientists and so on.
And so this is at a time, Philip, when the Australian government had been patiently and painstakingly trying to reassure the United States that Australia was a reliable security partner.
Exactly.
There were no, whatever reds we had under our beds were being sort of hauled out and shown the light of day. So how much embarrassment did this cause the government of the day?
Yes, it was more than embarrassment. They were angry. There's a document I read where Chifley said, "I am livid at this young man." And so Chifley put enormous pressure on the CSIRO to sack Kaiser. And they did. And they thought that that might mollify the Americans. But it of course didn't. They were alarmed because this is to do with scientific research impinging on defence projects. And probably what we don't realise is how crucial science and scientists were in the scheme of things.
So was this unreasonable, Philip? I mean, you can really see at some point down the track it was entirely possible, or you could certainly imagine a future where Kaiser would have decided that the arms race was unconscionable and it was up to him to then pass secrets on to his contacts within the Communist Party. It wasn't unreasonable for him to be sacked from that job from the CSIRO, was it? Or do you take a different view?
No, I do take a different view because CSIRO itself said that he deserved a mere reprimand, certainly not the dismissal. And a great many on the board argued that one's political beliefs were not in and by themselves a sufficient cause for dismissal. And that's why Tom himself couldn't understand why he was being treated so harshly. And also the board, the CSIRO board, and was unaware of these broader machinations with the Americans, the British, the embargo on classified documents and so on, which in turn had sprung from the Winona decrypts. So they're unaware of that. So it's highly unlikely that Tom Kaiser would have been sacked without this overarching picture of Australian, British, American relations at play, and the Australian government trying desperately to get the embargo lifted, to prove to the Americans, and the Secretary of the Department of Defence, Shedden, was going over to Washington frequently with reports saying, look at what we're doing to combat the comms, and the actions in the coal strike were one of those, and the formation of ASIO was yet another. And they were trying to demonstrate their anti-communist credentials, and then Tom Kaiser comes along and buggers it all up.
So what became of him, Philip, in the end, once he'd been sacked and blacklisted from the CSIRO?
Well, he then went for... He told me this when I met up with him in Sheffield not long before he died. He went for over 40 jobs in Australia and New Zealand. And in the CSIRO archives, I came across this remarkable document where he applied for the chair of physics at University of New England. And the selection committee thought he was by far the most brilliant candidate because of all those things I indicated before, his publications, etc., and that he had a brilliant career ahead of him and so on. But then the chair of the selection panel had written on the report, not suitable in view of past political activities. So Tom missed out on that one. So he went back to England. He was unemployed for a couple of years, tried to get jobs, but eventually he became chair of physics at Sheffield University, and he had his career then took off and awarded a gold medal on his retirement and so on and so on. So the end result for Tom wasn't devastating like it was for some of the other characters, but it did mean that Australia lost this store of scientific knowledge, this brilliant scientist.
Philip, going back to Menzies' anti-communist bill, the bill he introduced to Parliament to ban the Communist Party of Australia, is that all it was? Was it just like making the Communist Party a prescribed organisation, or did it go further than that?
Well, it went much further because all organisations, and we're talking a very large number, which were deemed front organisations of the Communist Party, were also liable for criminal action. Like it could be the New Theatre League or the Union of Australian Women and so on, which are regarded as front organisations. If you're a member of that and you were declared, the onus of proof fell on you, not on the prosecution, not on the government, to prove your innocence. So it reverses the age-old custom that the onus of proof is on the accuser, not the accused. So that was one aspect that went much further than simply banning the Communist Party.
Some of those organisations were strongly linked to the Communist Party of Australia and certainly or Communist Party infiltrated. Nonetheless, you were talking there about people who were deemed to be communists or to be fellow travellers. Who was going to do the deeming in this case? And I think this is really the critical important thing. Who was going to deem that someone was a communist or a communist sympathiser?
Yeah. This comes from the security services and in particular, sometimes special branch, which are attached to the state police forces, but overwhelmingly ASIO, putting communists or suspected communists under surveillance by examining their newspapers for names and by implanting people or by infiltrating people, and here we get to the sparrows, inside the Communist Party itself.
This, of course, would mean that people could be denounced by angry neighbours or someone they just didn't get along with or a rival for a promotion at work. What did Ben Chifley, the Labor leader, say about the proposed anti-communist bill at the time?
Yeah, so Ben Chifley said that this bill opens the door to the liar, the pimp and the perjurer. And he went on to say that, reputations and livelihoods will be destroyed.
Podcast. Broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler.
The case of Anne Neill, I think, is the story that really sort of blew my mind in your book, Philip. She was a member of the Adelaide branch of the Communist Party of Australia in the 1950s. This nice widow from Adelaide. She was one of these sparrows, these informants inserted by ASIO into the Communist Party. Tell me how this widow had been recruited by ASIO.
Well, because she received a leaflet about a peace meeting, which she thought was rather innocuous. And I think Anne was somewhat concerned about the effects of war because her late husband had died in part from the effects of gas from the war. And so she gave this leaflet to the Attorney General's office in South Australia and said, I don't think I want to have anything to do with this. This is on Mr. Menzies' prescribed list, this Australian Peace Council group. And they said, thank you very much, Anne, for just leave it with us. And soon after, she was contacted by what was to become her first case officer. And Anne was his first recruit. And so he recruited her in 1950 and said, look, just go along to this peace meeting and tell me what you think about it and any comments that you can gather and whether they make any statements about the Soviet Union and so on. Well, he was surprised by the scope, the detail and the clarity of her report. And this is the beginning of literally hundreds and hundreds of reports over the next 8 years. So within 7-8 months, she'd inveigled her way into the South Australian branch of the Australian Peace Council, and the secretary of whom was a chap called Elliot Johnson, who was also on the state committee of the Communist Party, and he, in a sense, looked after her, and she joined the Communist Party. And at one point, he said, anyone who thinks that this fluttery old lady could be working for the security police would have to be laughing. And of course, while they were laughing, she was meeting up sometimes nightly rendezvous in the Adelaide Hills with her case officer or handler from ASIO, giving him voluminous information.
You know, what's really remarkable, Philip, is that you've got documents from both the Communist Party of South Australia and ASIO full of praise for this woman's work. What a marvellous person she is. She's she's a real hard worker, gets on with the job,
yes.
is everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've got ASIO saying she is our number one spy.
Wow.
We've got the Communist Party saying she is one of our most important activists and so on in the party. So these two things are happening simultaneously.
But nonetheless, though, Phillip, to do what she had to do meant that she had to publicly become a communist. Now, she'd been a member of the Wesleyan Church.
That's right.
She'd been a member of the Liberal Party at one point. So what did that do to her relations with her friends and her family, who'd seen her go from being a conservative widow and homemaker to an extremely active communist?
Yes, only her sister knew that she was leading this double life, but she lost all her friends and her church contacts and her Liberal, it was then called the Liberal Country League, not Liberal Country Party in South Australia, which she was able to rejoin 10 years later. But in the meantime, she was so single-minded, so determined, so driven by a sense of duty, by a sense of patriotism, by the love of country, to fight this fight. And so, in a sense, this was like a calling, Richard. It was a higher duty that she must aspire to.
She went a very long way with it, though, Phillip, you show. The highlight of her career as a spy was that the Communist Party invited her to go to a conference in Vienna.
Yes.
And then to Moscow, and then to newly communist Peking in 1952. Bloody hell, she was game, wasn't she?
Oh, yes. Yeah. She did fear that in Moscow she may be injected. If she were found out, she may be injected with a lethal substance. So for ASIO, this is an absolute coup, because they'd never before had an agent that went into the belly of the beast, behind the Iron Curtain, to Vienna, to Moscow, to Beijing, which is now red after 1949 and so on. And all the time she's taking notes, getting photographs. There's photographs of her in the Moscow underground with her cultural Moscow handlers and so on.
So what was the thing that finally ended her service as a spy, as a sparrow, I should say, within the Communist Party of Australia?
Well, she attended Soviet Day celebrations in Canberra, and she met up with Petrov. And she and Petrov got on very well, just because, after all, she's a charming, middle-class housewife from Adelaide, and he gave her a signed book, and she invited he and Evdokia to stay at her place in late 1953. And that alerted the Communist Party in South Australia and the Central Committee of the Communist Party. It set off a few alarm bells. How does this woman know about Petrov? Because Petrov, by April 1954, is defected, and so she undergoes a very heavy interrogation. The door was locked. Fluorescent light went on for 2 hours. It was done very quickly and suddenly, so she couldn't be debriefed by a case officer. But she held up. She didn't crack. She got through it. And she answered all their questions, why she had joined 8 different front organisations, where she got the money from to travel behind the Iron Curtain, because they had to pay for themselves and so on. And she was terribly strong, terribly resilient. But there were a few within the party who said, no, this is too good to be true. We don't have someone who always pays their dues on time, who always is the first to put their hand up to not only make jams for the UAW or costumes for new theatre, but is always willing to do this hard work. And that's something that makes her a quite astonishing sparrow. And they then, by 1958, suspected her. And so ASIO said, no, we're going to pull her out. And she wanted to stay stay on. She said, no, a communist doesn't resign. So they invented this story.
So on the one hand, she's sort of like this incredibly active CWA lady within the Communist Party. Yes. But on the other hand, she's also she's like the inversion of a dedicated communist. Like, she's got strong ideology. It creates this incredible resilience in her. But what happened to her once ASIO said it's all over and you've got to get out and you've got to resume your old life as a conservative anti-communist again?
Well, the sort of memoir that she wrote in the mid-1950s, which ASIO deemed insufficiently literary to publish, she used that as the basis for a series of articles in a major Adelaide news, major Adelaide Daily. And so that's when she was officially out as a double agent. And then they were syndicated in Melbourne and Sydney newspapers and so on. And Menzies in Parliament thanked her, and Spry sent notes of thank you and a cutlery set for her for her 8 hard, long years of service.
Well, this is an extraordinary story. But what happened to the drift of her politics once she was out?
She didn't just drift, but she sort of ran to the far right, and she became embraced by the League of Rights, which was I don't think it's still around, but there'll be iterations of it that are a highly anti-Semitic, Holocaust-denying organisation. Its leader was a bloke called Eric Butler, to whom she came very close to and defended. And she would think that one example is that Murphy's raid on ASIO in 1973 was the result of an international Zionist conspiracy that he was acting on behalf of or at the behest of.
So she jumped right into the deep end, the kind of sump of anti-Semitism, did she?
Yes,
wow.
Yes, that's right. And then would go on speaking tours and everything about the dangers, not just of the Jewish conspiracy, but also of communists penetrating and permeating schools and universities, as well as these old-fashioned front organisations.
So the irony of this was eventually her politics again became disrespectable to her nice conservative friends after a while, who said, what are you doing hanging out with these people?
That's right. So she rejoined the church, embraced a type of evangelism, and lived to a ripe old age of 88, I think it was, but in an old people's home where she would see Russian spies under the bed and round the corner that they're coming to assassinate her.
What do you think this tells you then about the kind of person who agrees to become a sparrow? This is something John le Carré writes about all the time, and I'm a big fan of his. He always said that the spy business was for very, very strange antisocial people, and Smiley, his character, was unusual because he was burdened by a conscience. Like, there are people who are brought into it who are just the natural thieves, and the state just gives them license to indulge their larcenous snatches. There are other people who love the idea of a secret life. Do you think there's something about the character of people who can be persuaded to act like this, who want to do it, that there's a bit of a crack in their personality somewhere?
We can't generalise, of course, because the sparrows in the book were different and they operated from different motives. But in Anne Neill's case, I think there was a psychological need to have a handler or a case officer, there were 3 of them, as her confidant, as her... It's a bit like a confessional, going to the priest and being in the confessional box. And they would provide her with reassurance, with praise. Because remember, she was living an extremely unadventurous life. So there's that dimension that for some sparrows, that the life of the double life, the life of deceit, the life of duplicity, the life of mendacity appealed. It had a degree of adventure and excitement to it. So I can't discount that completely from her case, whereas I think in the case of other sparrows that are in the book, that was probably more to the forefront. But yes, so I think there's a psychological need, but we must remember that ultimately she was driven. It's almost like an ideology, like one ASIO officer said at one point, poor Anne, she has to spend all this time with people she hates. And she did hate them, but she would smile and put on this affable, charming front. And so they were...
It's mad.
They were seduced.
It's all mad. It is so mad, isn't it? I mean, you could argue that she was perhaps doing good work for Australia. I mean, insofar as you could have seen the Communist Party of South Australia being much of a threat to the stability of Australian democracy in the 1950s.
A couple of dozen members there.
Yeah, right. This brings us to the case of Michael Brown, another individual in your book, who was a British serviceman, and he had been based in South Australia, once again, what is it with Adelaide, at the Weapons Research Establishment, the WRE, outside of Adelaide, which was undertaking top-secret weapons research for the British. Tell me how he was caught as a spy for working on behalf of the Soviets.
Yeah, there was a search in the locker rooms by security personnel. They're actually looking for stolen money, but they came across his kit bag and there were some carbon copies of classified documents. And I said, okay, Michael, open up your locker. And there were more. And what transpired is that he had been passing top secret documents to a Ukrainian contact in Adelaide for very little money, £15, something like that, who then passed them to the Soviets.
Michael Brown himself, this airman who'd been handing over secrets, was he a communist or was he just doing it for the cash?
No, I don't think he was a communist. He was doing it for the cash. So in a sense, he wasn't a full-blown Soviet spy, but he assisted their cause. There's nothing in the court records or the British archives to suggest that he had been a member of the British Communist Party, rather that he'd been a very lonely individual, someone who'd had a very difficult sort of upbringing. His mum had been in a psychiatric institution and so on. And obviously someone who was intelligent.
Well, yes, but how did the security services in Australia and Britain, MI5 and ASIO, react once they realised that this British airman had been handing over secrets to a Ukrainian agent in Adelaide?
Now, interestingly, neither ASIO nor MI5 wanted this Ukrainian contact to be arrested or any publicity about the case to be revealed.
Why not?
Because they were terribly concerned, again, about that embargo, the embargo on classified information being reimposed.
So they were worried that if it was discovered that this British airman in Adelaide, South Australia, had been handing over secrets to some strange Ukrainian spy in Adelaide, which is pretty wild all of its own, that if that was discovered by the Americans, or again, all the patient work they'd been undertaking to rebuild trust with the Americans, yes, we British, yes, we Australians can be trusted with your important secrets, that'd just be gone. Once again, it'll all be knocked down again.
That's right. And as a result, Prime Minister Menzies and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan actually colluded. And these were documents that I found in the British archives, not the Australian archives, colluded to keep the case quiet. Because Macmillan had hoped that the free flow of information would occur. Menzies was hoping, of course, that the same would happen in Australia without strings attached, particularly to do with atomic development and missile weapons research, because they needed American know-how and technology to accelerate the process. So they colluded to keep the whole thing quiet.
So he was arrested and charged with a pretty minor charge in Australia. He was charged with conduct to the prejudice of good order of Her Majesty's forces, which is a very vague charge, which allowed the authorities to detain him so he could be repatriated to England and dealt with. But then he escaped. How did he escape?
Well, an unknown fellow prisoner was able to pass him the key to a padlock, which he used when the guard was asleep to escape from his cell. Now, that key also opened the front gates. So he was able to get out of the prison encampment, got a car, headed for the South Australian border. There was talk about his communist friends, because they believed him to be a communist, his communist friends picking him up in Victoria, whisking him off to Port Melbourne and to get on a boat and Scapa. but police on the border up near the Murray picked up this car in the bush, fixed their headlights on it, and there he was, and said, yes, I stole the car. But then, of course, it was revealed who he was. A journalist for the Adelaide News got a sniff of this, and he was going to publish his story. And Menzies asked, now it's a bit murky here because Rupert Murdoch completely denies it, but it would appear that Menzies asked Rupert, who was the proprietor of the Adelaide News, to suppress the story.
So, Philip, if you were writing this as a movie, this moment where he switches padlocks and it just so happens that the key unlocks the padlock, also unlocks the gate, you just would never put that in a movie. You just wouldn't. It goes some way to showing how pathetic the security arrangements were at this top secret long-range missile project in South Australia.
Yes.
How did Menzies respond when he found out about this?
Deep anxiety doesn't quite convey his desperation to get this thing solved and fixed and so on. And what came out in his court-martial was the lax security, not of the Australian authorities, because remember it's a British airbase at Edinburgh and then the adjacent Salisbury, the lax security by the RAF. And so ASIO sends in a top team to find out not only who the Ukrainian was, but also to advise the British on improving their security arrangements. So, yes, it was a source of embarrassment, but also, just like Chifley was livid, absolutely livid about Tom Kaiser, so Menzies was deeply troubled and deeply concerned about Michael Brown, this sole British airman.
So once they caught him in the car and they got him on a plane and got him back to England, how did his court-martial go?
Well, he had a very effective barrister, a young woman, like she's in her 30s, Jean Southworth. And he changed his plea from not guilty to guilty and said, look, it's a minor misdemeanor. It's not a case of serious espionage, and convinced the military court to let him off lightly. But I'm convinced that his light sentence was again, and this is only my surmising, was again to downplay, because the Americans now were aware of it, because it's become public, to downplay the seriousness of what had occurred in the desert sands of South Australia.
Well, this goes back to a time when Britain and the United States weren't as tightly enmeshed in their defence arrangements as they are now. And Britain was desperate to get a seat at the top table alongside the United States,
yes,
where America would share its nuclear secrets with Britain. And in the meantime, this is why they were in war in the first place. They were trying to set up their own long-range missile system outside of America's help. So at this time, 58, you've got Prime Minister Macmillan of Great Britain visiting Australia, and you have him and Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies seriously discussing the desirability of Australia getting nuclear weapons. Was this really serious, or was this sort of battered aside pretty quickly, Philip?
Menzies held back on the idea of atomic weaponry for deterrent purposes, but that didn't preclude the close and intimate involvement with the British in testing missile-guided rockets, hence the Woomera rocket range. And these weapons, of course, were to be used in the event of a nuclear war. And Australia also participated actively and unhesitatingly in the atomic tests that Britain undertook in the 1950s at Montebello Islands and so on, and elsewhere. Australia was happy to be a subordinate partner to the British in the British quest for atomic development, for atomic weaponry. And the reason why the British wanted Australia to be is because they had been shut out from the American cupboard, if you like, ever since 1946. Britain was out in the cold, so it went to Australia to use our facilities, to use our resources, to use our space for the development of both atomic weaponry and the missile project called the Long Range Weapons Project.
In John le Carré's great book, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, he has the traitor character saying at the end of the book, that, I'm quoting him here, that the only real measure of a nation's political health, the only real expression of its subconscious, is its spy services. What do you think of that comment?
The attitude towards the security services by the government, and I guess by the community at large, is in fact a litmus test of the extent to which democracy and democratic liberties can be juggled with instruments or organisations dedicated to protecting national security. And that balance between the two, sort of civil liberties on the one hand and identification of threats and stymieing those threats to national security on the other, is very difficult to get right. In the 1950s, I'd say that the majority of the population, and certainly the Menzies government, would have agreed that civil liberties had to be forsaken or had to be diminished in order for that threat to national security to be met. That shifted, of course, in the 1970s and the 1980s. And during the 1970s, 1980s, the ASIO had a bad name to it. The Hope Royal Commission into Security Services found that ASIO didn't get that balance right, that their concern with subversion conflated fears that were not sufficiently well-grounded or not sufficiently well-based, criticising very sharply ASIO's priorities, its definition of subversion, and its readiness to circumvent accustomed civil liberties that democratic societies had fought long and hard for.
Well, this is always the paradox, isn't it, in these situations? How far do you suspend democracy in defence of democracy?
Yeah, that's right. And as I said before, juggling the right balance requires very careful thinking through and a knowledge of the past and what has happened in the past. So I think that the activities of ASIO in the 1950s, when it was aimed at suspected subversion, was out of proportion to what was necessary. And that imbalance, if you like, contains lessons for our current security services as they embark on different sorts of threats, not from the far left, but to an extent from the far right, and until recently from so-called Islamic extremism in Australia.
Phillip, your book is completely fascinating and it's had me thinking a long time, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's been a pleasure.
Phillip Deary's book is called Spies and Sparrows, ASIO and the Cold War. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
For more episodes, hit subscribe or grab the ABC Listen app and listen to this show and many others all ad-free.